Well, good morning. Today we're going to talk about literature, specifically African American literature. Literature helps us understand the circumstances, struggles, and accomplishments of people we would otherwise never know. Through the use of characterization, imagination, and psychological insight, literature lets us identify with and empathize with people of diverse backgrounds and experiences. The literature of displaced Africans and marginalized African Americans provides us with an opportunity to learn from the inside what exploitation and repression look like, so that we can dismantle racism from the inside, from inside our individual selves and from within our institutions. To devote a Sunday in February to exploring the literature of African Americans means to choose just a few authors out of a bewildering number to lift up and learn from their lives as well as their works. Today we'll spend a little time with the poet Phyllis Wheatley and the novelists and short story writers Richard Wright and James Baldwin. Phyllis Wheatley, as you may remember from your high school English class, is considered the first African American author of a published book of poetry. It's an interesting name, Phyllis Wheatley. All of our names are interesting, of course, the product of history, culture, evolution, and inheritance. My name is Peter Connolly. I didn't choose it. It was presented to me shortly after birth. Connolly, C-O-N-N-O-L-L-Y, is one version of a name that's spelled in a variety of other ways, at least 3 others I know of. It's a reduction from and a transliteration from an Irish Gaelic name, O'Concacale, meaning fierce as a hound. This kind of etymological investigation is fun, isn't it? Revealing mysterious little tidbits of our history, provoking our imaginations. What could have led to this appellation in what foggy distances of time? For persons such as Phyllis Wheatley, for all those Africans kidnapped from their homelands in order to feed the lust of the slave trade, all sense of past and tradition have vanished. She was taken from her home in West Africa, probably from one of 2 countries now known as Gambia and Senegal. In 1761, she was sold into slavery at the age of 7 or 8. She received the name Wheatley from the family of a wealthy Boston merchant, John Wheatley, and his wife Susanna, who purchased her. Her life in this country, even before it was this country, was a strange mixture of kind treatment, exploitation, privilege, travel, fame, poverty, and obscurity. Young Ms. Wheatley must have had an African name by which she went until she was sold by a local chief to a visiting trader and deported, but no record of it is known to exist. The Wheatleys did not name her for an ancestor or in honor of a biblical matriarch, as was so often done in those days, but for the ship on which she traveled from Africa to the colonies, the Phyllis, P-H-I-L-L-I-S. Imagine being named for the ship that was responsible for uprooting your life and delivering you into slavery. Phyllis was bought by John Wheatley as a gift for his wife, Susanna. Mr. Wheatley was known throughout the colony, the Massachusetts colony, as particularly progressive for the time. Though enslaved persons were commonly forbidden to learn to read and write, and women were not encouraged either, the Wheatleys appointed their 18-year-old daughter, Mary, to be Phyllis's tutor. The level of her education appears to have been unprecedented for an enslaved person at that time. By the age of 12, she was reading the Greek and Latin classics in the original languages. She studied difficult passages in the Bible. She was exposed to the poetry of Homer, Virgil, Horace, Milton, and Alexander Pope. She wrote her first poem, an homage to Harvard College, when she was 14. She appeared so talented and so precocious that the Wheatleys left the household chores to their other slaves and supported Phyllis's education and intellectual development. At the age of 20, Phyllis accompanied the Wheatleys' son, Nathaniel, to London because Susanna thought there's a much better chance of her getting her book of poems published there than in the colonies. She had an audience with the Lord Mayor of London. There was even a meeting with King George III planned, but she had returned to America by the time that could be scheduled. The Countess of Huntington became interested in young Phyllis and subsidized the publication of a volume of her poems, which appeared in the summer of 1773. In November of that year, the Wheatleys freed Phyllis Wheatley. Susanna died in the spring of the following year, and John died 4 years after that in 1778. Shortly after that, Phyllis married John Peters, who's described as an impoverished black grocer. Their living conditions were poor. 2 of their babies died. John did not manage the finances very well and was imprisoned for debt in 1784. Phyllis, having to support herself and a sickly child, became a scullery maid in a boarding house. She had never done such work before, of course. The working conditions were a challenge to her health, especially as she suffered from chronic asthma all her life. She developed pneumonia and died on December 5th, 1874, at the age of 31, having given birth to a daughter who died on the same day. Once she'd received her freedom and her benefactors died, Phyllis was left with no support structure. Her success as a published poet was based on an insecure foundation. Was she freed by her manumission or condemned to poverty and obscurity? Sometimes it seems that all our blessings are mixed blessings. Phyllis Wheatley often dedicated her poems to famous figures. In 1775, she sent a copy of her poem to His Excellency George Washington, to the man himself, a military general at the time. At his invitation, she visited him at his headquarters in Cambridge. He praised her poetry. Wheatley's poetry focused on 3 themes primarily: the classical world of the Greeks and Romans, the various attributes of the sun god of her African heritage, and her own Christianity, which she believed delivered her from paganism and provided her hope for eternal salvation. The style of her poetry seems dated now, as does much poetry from the 18th century. Of the little of her work that I know, I like best her 7-stanza poem, On Imagination. One stanza best captures her style and skill, I think, as she sings a song of praise to imagination itself, that faculty that allows us to escape from whatever drudgery the day may bring. Imagination, who can sing thy force, or who describe the swiftness of thy course, soaring through air to find the bright abode, the imperial palace of the thundering god. We on thy pinions can surpass the wind and leave the rolling universe behind. From star to star the mental optics rove, measure the skies and range the realms above. There in one view we grasp the mighty whole, or with new worlds amaze the unbounded soul. The stories of Richard Wright and James Baldwin are more contemporary. 4 of Wright's novels and a short story collection were published in my lifetime. All 6 of Baldwin's novels were published in my lifetime, and probably in many cases in yours. Both wrote extensively on the experience of race in America. Much of their writing was based on their own experience of prejudice and bigotry. Richard Wright was born in 1908 in a little place called Rucker's Plantation, not too far from Natchez, Mississippi. He was the son of a sharecropper and a school teacher. His grandfathers had been born into slavery and were freed only after their service to the Union in the Civil War. Richard's father left the boy and the family when he was only 6 years old. There was no contact between them for 25 years. Richard's mother, Ella, moved the family to Natchez in 1911 or 1912 to be with her parents. There, a tragic accident occurred. The little boy, aged 7 or 8, accidentally set the house on fire. His mother's response was to beat him until he was unconscious. A few years later, Ella sent Richard and his brother to an orphanage run by the Methodist Church for a short time before enrolling him in the Howe Institute, another Methodist institution. A short time later, Ella moved the family to Arkansas to live with her sister Maggie and her husband. When Richard was the age of 12, still not having completed even one full year of education, and after Ella was incapacitated by a stroke, the family moved once again to the home of his maternal grandmother, which was now in the state capital of Jackson. His grandparents, still harboring rage for Richard for having set their house on fire, repeatedly beat him and his brother. As you can tell, after Richard's father left the family, his upbringing was unstable at best. When he was finally able to attend school on a regular basis, Richard progressed quickly and graduated as the class valedictorian of his junior high in 1925. He was assigned to write a speech for graduation day, as valedictorians often are, but on that day he was called to the principal's office and given a prepared speech to read aloud. Wright challenged the principal, telling him that the audience had come to hear a speech by the students, not by the administration. The principal threatened to withhold his diploma, then changed tactics to entice him with the opportunity to be a teacher in the school. Wright did not back down, and in the end was able to convince the white officials to let him deliver his own prepared remarks. Excuse me. At the age of 17, in 1925, Wright moved on his own to Memphis, Tennessee. His hunger for books was so great, we are told, that Wright devised a successful ploy to borrow books from the segregated white library. He used a library card belonging to a white coworker and presented it with a note that claimed that he was picking up books for the white man. In this way, he could read books that were forbidden to black people at that time in the South, and had access as well to such magazines as the Atlantic Monthly, Harper's, and American Mercury, the intellectual magazines at the time. In 1926, he made up his mind to leave the Jim Crow South. With his mother and brother, became part of the Great Migration North, moving to Chicago, where he found employment as a United States postal clerk. He continued to read, especially intrigued by those writers critical of the political system that subjugated great numbers of people because of their race. He joined the John Reed Club, a Marxist organization, and later the Communist Party. He began to write poems from the perspective of the proletariat. He became a revolutionary poet. In 1933, he founded the South Side Writers Group, whose members included Arna Bontemps, known as a member of the Harlem Renaissance, and Margaret Walker, now considered part of the Chicago Black Renaissance. Wright's first novel, Cesspool, was rejected by 8 publishers, but in 1936, he, for the first time, had a story, Big Boy Leaves Home, published in 2 anthologies. In 1940, when the American Communist Party joined the Stalinists in supporting the entry of the United States into World War II, Wright resigned from the party. Richard Wright's breakthrough as a writer occurred in 1938 with the publication of Uncle Tom's Children, 4 short stories, some based on lynching in the Deep South. Reception was positive, and sales were good enough to allow him to move to Harlem, where he began to write his most famous novel, Native Son. Based on the success of that book of short stories, Wright applied for and received a Guggenheim Fellowship, which provided him with a stipend that allowed him to finish that book. Native Son is a violent book, a book that argues that being a black man in America so grievously restricts opportunity for advancement that very few options are possible. Further, it argues that being black, while found in a compromising position, forces one into panic mode, where the choices offered one often leave violence as the surest remedy. The title character is Bigger Thomas, who, at the age of 20, is living in utter poverty, sharing a single rat-infested room with his mother, sister, and brother. In an early scene, Bigger kills a large rat with a frying pan, then terrorizes his sister with the dead animal. Is he just naturally a bully and a sadist? Or do his living conditions inform his consciousness with resentment, simmering anger, and then provoke irrational acts of violence? When we read this book in college, under the tutelage of famed literary critic Philip Roth, we were told that Native Son was little more than propaganda, that its sociological argument dwarfed its literary legitimacy. And I remember bristling at what seemed to be a poorly informed reactionary reading at the time, but I must say I haven't forgotten that, and I find myself sitting on this fence even still. Nevertheless, in 1940, the Book of the Month Club found the book to be of sufficient literary worth to choose it as its first book by an African-American author. It sold like wildfire, 250,000 copies in just a few months. In the book, Bigger Thomas gets a job in the house of a fairly wealthy, well-meaning white family. They treat him kindly, but he often can't understand their sophisticated vocabulary and their well-developed intellectual ideas. He gets confused. He doesn't know what is expected of him. Used to being treated as a second-class citizen, or maybe third class, he has a hard time getting used to being treated as almost an equal. Mary, the daughter of the family, is politically progressive and criticizes her father for being a capitalist, a word Bigger does not understand. The Irish cook warns Bigger to avoid Mary's communist friends because they'll only bring trouble. But Bigger has a room in the house of his own, something new and unique in his life, and when invited to be the young people's chauffeur for a night, and then invited to share the rum they are drinking, and when Mary gets drunk and seduces him, things get very confused very quickly. I won't say more about the plot's developments except to say things get grisly. Bigger feels trapped and does things he would never do if he didn't find himself in a compromising position with white youths on a night of drunken recklessness. In Native Son, the message is expressed by Bigger to his friend Gus when he says, they, the white people, don't let us do nothing, and I can't get used to it. When stripped of your dignity, you become overly sensitive to insults and discrimination and are prone to make snap decisions that sooner or later are going to get you into trouble so deep you can't make your way out. The fact that a novel proclaims such a theme, the fact that a novel that proclaims such a theme got chosen by the prestigious Book of the Month Club was significant. It offered a clearer picture than ever to white America that continued oppression of black citizens did nothing to promote a better life for them. Such oppression and the confusion when oppressive measures are suddenly lifted can only lead to dangerous and deadly actions that benefit nobody in the end. As critic Irving Howe said, Native Son brought into the open as no one ever had before, the hatred, fear, and violence that have crippled and may yet destroy our culture. The Modern Library placed Native Son number 20 on the list of 100 best novels of the 20th century. Time magazine also included the novel in its Time 100 Best English Language Novels from 1923, when the magazine was founded, to 2005. James Baldwin shares with Richard Wright a body of work that focuses on the themes of race, class, sexuality, and what it means to be a man. Baldwin differs from Wright in that the relationships he explores include healthy and complex connections between Black and white Americans, the civil rights movement, and, as a gay man, the gay liberation movement. His protagonists seek acceptance within the society, but struggle as well to accept themselves. Fiction, all too often, gets dismissed by some as not real, so not worth their time. But only fiction can explore the deep psychological complexity of being human across sex, age, class, and cultural boundaries. James Baldwin was born James Arthur Jones in 1924 in New York City to a single mother who never revealed the name of his biological father. There were rumors that he was a drug addict. Other rumors said that he had died. James did not know, and neither do we. His mother, Emma, a native of Maryland, was also part of the Great Migration, arriving in Harlem at the tender age of 19. In 1927, when James was 3 years old, Mother Emma married David Baldwin, who was both a laborer and a Baptist preacher. David's mother was born enslaved and lived with the couple and their children in New York until her death when James was 7. David and Emma had 8 children together. Young James did not have an easy relationship with his stepfather, who seemed to distrust education. Baldwin's biographer, David Adam Leeming, says they fought because James read books, because he liked movies, and because he had white friends, all of which David Baldwin thought threatened James's salvation. And though he was a Christian preacher, David Baldwin hated white people. Another Baldwin biographer, James Campbell, states that David's devotion to God was mixed with the hope that God would take revenge on white people for him. David was an angry man, especially after getting laid off from his job at a soft drinks bottling factory, and he took his anger out on his family. His children became fearful of him. His mental condition deteriorated so much that his paranoia led to his commitment in a mental asylum in 1943, where he died of tuberculosis. A chaotic family environment for a sensitive boy devoted to reading and dreaming of becoming a writer. James was compassionate enough to recognize the pressures that affected his stepfather's mental health, and found a way to reconcile with him, though it was after David's death. In his book of essays called Notes of a Native Son, James Baldwin writes, "In his outrageously and protective way, he loved his children who were Black like him and menaced like him." James Baldwin was a precocious child. By the time he reached 5th grade, he had read A Tale of Two Cities by Dickens, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and even some of Dostoevsky's work. At age 14, Baldwin applied to and was accepted by a predominantly white and predominantly Jewish school in the Bronx called DeWitt Clinton High School, where his passion for writing flourished. He conducted interviews, wrote poems, edited his own work and the work of others. And when he realized that he was attracted to men rather than women, his guilt prompted him to recommit to the church, even to the extent of becoming a young preacher himself. At age 14, Brother Baldwin first took to the podium. He spoke in the same fiery way that he'd heard in the churches he grew up in, and he found that his extemporaneous speaking style could stir up the congregation, providing him with a sense of authority he otherwise lacked. In an essay later, he admitted that his preaching, though he could not know it at the time, was a mask for self-hatred and despair. Salvation, he said, stopped at the church door. Baldwin's writing career was based on a need to understand and to be understood. In his essays and stories, he explored the feelings of anger, outrage, and even hatred that he felt as a black man, marginalized and refused service in restaurants, even in New York. He had a sensitive nature, even more sensitive than most to the slights and indignities he had to suffer because of his race. In addition, he used writing to explore his own sense of confusion and sometimes self-contempt as he struggled to come to terms with his sexuality. As a black man and a gay man, he felt doubly marginalized, doubly ostracized, doubly discriminated against. He moved to Greenwich Village, where a more liberal outlook among those, bohemian and counterculture, who lived and worked there, allowed him to feel freer to be himself, express himself, and explore the full range of his interests, artistic and personal. He took an acting class at the New School, where he met and became friends with Marlon Brando, a friendship that endured through the civil rights movement and beyond. He met Richard Wright in 1945, several years after the publication of Native Son. He showed Wright an early manuscript of Go Tell It on the Mountain, which Wright liked enough to show to his publisher, which secured Baldwin a $500 advance. His years in Greenwich Village allowed Baldwin to make a number of connections with the publishing world, including Randall Jarrell at The Nation, Saul Levitas at The New Leader, and Philip Rav at Partisan Review. His essays about the black experience in America began to be published, and his career as a writer began to be established. By 1924, though, he was disgusted with the treatment that African Americans received on a routine basis in this country, and he moved to Paris, where he felt the exhilaration of being accepted, being seen as somewhat of an exotic, perhaps, but not insulted, not looked down upon, not discriminated against. He spent 9 years in Paris, poor most of the time, but able to meet others on the literary scene, such as Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Truman Capote, Stephen Spender, and many others. He learned an artist's way of being in the world, exploring, finding and creating new vistas, finding his place in community. He engaged in the first significant love affair of his life, described as a near obsession, with a young man with whom he later shared a friendship for almost 40 years. In 1953, Baldwin published his first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, a semi-autobiographical coming-of-age story that he began writing when he was 17. His second novel, Giovanni's Room, published 3 years later, caused a major controversy because of its explicitly homoerotic theme. Baldwin refused to be pigeonholed, refused to write only what he called protest novels, refused to confine himself to writing about only black characters. Giovanni's Room is primarily about white persons. He learned about the racist murder of Emmett Till while he was still in Paris in 1955. The play Blues for Mr. Charlie was his protesting response. As he grew older, James Baldwin experimented more with his fiction. Another Country and Tell Me How Long the Train's Been Gone deal with characters who are black and white, heterosexual, gay, and bisexual. His outrage at the treatment of African Americans caused him to devote himself to the civil rights movement, and of course his outspokenness drew criticism and controversy, but that did nothing but sharpen his critique. The three writers I've spoken about today certainly had their differences. Phyllis Wheatley's story is one of self-expression and self-exploration, designed to finding a way to fit in, to be accepted, to prove her worth. Richard Wright's is a story of howling protest against injustice, an outraged voice claiming that a racist country that systematically denied opportunities to Black Americans left little option but violence, born out of oppression and confusion. James Baldwin battled against the twin biases against African Americans and gay people. His solution was to find a like-minded community, first in Greenwich Village, then in Paris, places from which he was free to assess and critique, which provided him a home base, a place where he felt free to explore the full dimension of his humanity. But the three had things in common, too. Primarily a willingness to explore both themselves and the world around them, to find a way to be seen and heard, to find a way through the intellect and the imagination to show the world that race is no determinant of worth, and enlivened by risk-taking, and that work enlivened by risk-taking can lead one through obstacles that might otherwise seem insurmountable. That perseverance through obstacles, even systemic obstacles, can result in a success not dreamed of in times of quiet desperation. These are lessons we can all profit from. February is Black History Month. We would do well to look more deeply into the work of these pioneers and so many others whose experiences increase our understanding, elicit our compassion, and feed our passion for justice in this land. At this time in our service, we have an offering for the work of this church and the work of this church in this community. The cash in the plate this month will be donated to the NAACP Brockton branch for their work in the area and in the state.